Victor's hand clamped onto my wrist as he dragged me toward the center of the Romano Gala stage. It wasn't a gesture of love, it was a leash. Every camera in the ballroom flashed like a firing squad. I tried to pull away, but the man I'd spent 7 years building an empire for just smiled into the lenses. "Elena, you're not a Romano anymore," he whispered, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and betrayal. He shoved a manila envelope into my chest, the divorce papers, hard enough to make me stumble. 500 of the city's elite watched as my dignity hit the floor alongside the papers. I was being erased in real time. "Mr. Romano." The voice cut through the whispers like a gunshot in a library. The temperature in the room plummeted. Dante Valenko stepped out of the shadows, 6 feet of tailored lethal energy. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes stayed on Victor's hand, which was still bruising my wrist. "You seem to be confused," Dante said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "You don't throw away a diamond because you're too weak to hold it." Dante's gaze flicked to me, then back to my husband. "You were finished here, weren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was an eviction notice. The heavy oak doors of the Valenko estate closed with a finality that silenced the distant echoes of the gala. Inside, the air smelled of old parchment, expensive leather, and a hint of something cold, like rain on a graveyard. Dante Valenko didn't go to the ornate parlor. He led me into a private study where the walls were lined with monitors displaying flickering data streams and silent security feeds. "Drink?" he asked, not looking back as he walked toward a mahogany sideboard. "I want to know why you did it," I said, my voice trembling despite the fire burning in my chest. I sat on the edge of a velvet chair, the manila envelope containing my divorce papers still clutched in my hand like a jagged piece of glass. "Why stop the show? You don't even know me." Dante poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler and brought it to me. His fingers brushed mine, a brief, grounding contact that felt like an electric current. "I know your husband, Elena. Or rather, I know his ledgers. Victor Romano is a man who builds his castles on quicksand and calls it architecture." He sat behind a desk that looked like it belonged to a general, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of the monitors. "For 3 years, I've watched Victor siphon funds from the Romano-Morty merger. He didn't just divorce you tonight, he liquidated you. That paperwork in your hand, it's a confession. By the time the ink is dry on the court filing, your family's remaining assets will be transferred to a shell company controlled by his mother, Isabella." My heart skipped. My father's legacy, he's taking the shipping docks. "He's already sold them," Dante said calmly, leaning forward. "To the Vargas Syndicate, my rivals. Victor thinks he's playing a game of chess, but he's just a pawn who doesn't realize the board is on fire." I looked down at the papers. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. I had been a ghost in my own marriage, a silent partner to my own destruction. "I don't just want to stop him, Elena. I want to dismantle him." Dante's voice was a low, lethal hum. "But I need someone who knows the internal codes. Someone who knows where the Romanos bury their skeletons. Victor made the mistake of thinking you were invisible. I want to make you his greatest nightmare." He slid a slim, black tablet across the desk. It was already open to a series of encrypted files. "This is a key to my network. Work for me. Be my eyes inside the shadow accounts he thinks I can't see. In return, I'll give you the protection of the Valenko name and the resources to take back every cent, every dock, and every bit of dignity he stole from you tonight." I looked from the tablet to the man who was essentially a stranger, yet the only person who hadn't looked at me with pity. "Why help me?" I whispered. "Because," Dante said, his dark eyes locking onto mine with terrifying intensity, "I hate a waste of talent, and I've always wanted to see a Romano burn." I reached out, my fingers hovering over the screen. The choice was a bridge. On one side was the woman who had been discarded, on the other was someone I didn't recognize yet. I tapped the screen, and the light reflected in my eyes. The war had begun. The digital glow of the Valenko tablet felt like a loaded weapon in my hands as I sat in the backseat of Dante's armored sedan. We were parked a block away from the Via Roma, the city's most exclusive espresso bar, and the undisputed headquarters of high society gossip. Through the tinted glass, I watched Sofia Bellucci step out of her car, her designer heels clicking with the rhythm of a woman who held the city's reputation in her manicured hands. "You're sure about this?" Dante asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. He didn't look at me, but I could see his reflection in the window, watchful, predatory, and strangely expectant. "Victor thinks I was just a trophy on his arm," I whispered, my fingers dancing across the screen to pull up the Project Phoenix file, a fraudulent real estate merger Victor had been hiding even from his mother. He forgot that I was the one who proofread his contracts for 7 years. I know exactly where the foundations are cracked. I didn't need to steal his money yet. I just needed to steal his confidence. With a single tap, I forwarded an anonymous, encrypted summary of the Phoenix debt ratios to Sophia's private tip line. I knew her habits. She lived for the thrill of being the first to break a titan. I stepped out of the car, adjusting the collar of the silk trench coat Dante's people had provided. It felt like armor. I walked into the cafe, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and whispered scandals. Sophia was already staring at her phone, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the data I'd just sent. "Elena," Sophia looked up, her expression a mix of pity and sudden, sharp curiosity. "I heard about the gala. I am so sorry." I didn't flinch. I sat across from her, leaning in just enough to ensure the surrounding tables noticed. "Don't be sorry, Sophia. Be careful. Victor is making moves that even the Romanos can't back up. Have you seen the latest reports on the Phoenix merger? It's a house of cards." I didn't have to say more. Sophia's gaze flicked back to her phone, then to me, the pity in her eyes replaced by the predatory gleam of a socialite who smelled blood in the water. By the time I finished my espresso and walked back to Dante's car, the notification pings were already starting. Sophia had posted a blind item that was anything but blind. I pulled up Victor's company ticker on the tablet. The line was a jagged cliff, plunging red as investors scrambled to verify the leak. "The stock is down 12%, I said, sliding back into the seat next to Dante. For the first time in years, the knot in my stomach wasn't from fear. It was from the cold, intoxicating taste of power. Dante looked at the screen, then at me, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Well done, Elena. You didn't just hurt his wallet. You made him look like an amateur." "This is just the first floor," I replied, watching the red numbers continue to fall. "I'm going to take the whole building." The smell of incense and old stone always used to settle my nerves, but as Dante's car pulled up to the weathered steps of St. Jude's, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the chapel where my father had been laid to rest 10 years ago, after a tragic industrial accident at the Romano Morti docks. At the time, I had been too drowned in grief to notice the convenience of his death. Dante didn't say a word as he led me inside. He didn't have to. His presence was a heavy, comforting weight at my back, shielding me from the chill of the vaulted ceiling. In the front pew, a man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see through time was waiting. Father Lorenzo didn't look like a priest who dealt only in prayers. He looked like a keeper of secrets. "Dante," the priest murmured, rising slowly. "I wondered if you would bring her here." "The time for silence has passed, Lorenzo," Dante said, his voice echoing off the marble. "She started the fire. Now she needs to know what she's burning down." Lorenzo turned to me, his expression softening into a look of profound sorrow. He reached into the folds of his cassock and pulled out a small, yellowed ledger, the kind my father used to carry in his breast pocket. "Your father came to me 3 nights before the docks went up in flames, Elena. He was terrified. He'd found a discrepancy in the Romano accounts, money moving toward offshore interests that didn't exist." I felt the air leave my lungs. He told me it was just a mechanical failure, a freak spark in the warehouse. "That is what the Romanos told the police. That is what Isabella Romano paid the fire marshal to say," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He opened the ledger to the final page. There, in my father's cramped, precise handwriting, was a list of dates and signatures. The last signature wasn't Victor's. It was Isabella. "He wasn't just working for them, Elena. He was going to expose them," Dante intervened, his hand coming to rest on my shoulder, grounding me. Isabella didn't just want the Morty assets. She wanted the Morty silence. Your father's death wasn't an accident, it was a business transaction. The realization hit me harder than Victor's public divorce. My entire marriage had been a farce, a decades-long strategy to keep me close, keep me quiet, and ensure the Morty bloodline remained under the Romano thumb. My husband hadn't just humiliated me, he had slept beside the daughter of the man his mother had murdered. The ink on this page is the truth, Alina, Father Lorenzo said, closing the book. And the blood on their hands hasn't dried yet. I looked at the ledger, then up at Dante. The pain was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. Victor was a pawn, but Isabella was the king, and I was no longer playing for a settlement. I was playing for a reckoning. The training didn't take place in a gym or a classroom, but in the chaotic, gray-toned heart of the city's industrial district. Marco De Luca stood by the brick wall of a deserted warehouse, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light. He was a man of few words, his silence a weapon honed by decades of service to the Valenko name. "Eyes on the glass, Alina," Marco said, his voice a gravelly low tone that commanded attention. He pointed toward a grimy shop window across the street. "Don't look at the street directly, look at the reflections. The world is a mirror if you know how to tilt it." I stared into the distorted glass, watching the rhythmic flow of pedestrians. "What am I looking for?" "Patterns, not people," he replied. "A person walking is just a stranger. A person stopping every time you stop, or a car that makes 3 left turns to stay behind you, that's a predator. Victor isn't sophisticated enough for a professional hit yet. He's panicked. Panicked men hire cheap talent." I focused, my eyes scanning the reflection of a black sedan parked at the far corner. It had been there since we left the chapel. When we moved, it moved. When we lingered, it idled. "The black sedan," I whispered, the realization chilling my blood. "It's been behind us for 6 blocks. Marco nodded almost imperceptibly. "Good, look at the driver, side mirror." I adjusted my stance, catching a glimpse of a man in a hooded sweatshirt, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't have the polished veneer of Victor's usual security. He had the jagged, desperate look of the street-level thugs Victor used to clean up messier business disputes. "He thinks he's intimidating you," Marco said, stepping closer to me, his presence a wall of granite. "Victor wants you to feel small again. He wants you to think that even with Dante, you aren't safe." "He's wrong," I said, a new kind of steel hardening in my voice. I watched the thug through the reflection. He was amateur, sloppy, a reflection of Victor's own crumbling composure. "He's not trying to kill me, he's trying to track where I'm going." "Then let's give him a destination he won't forget," Marco said, reaching into his jacket and handing me a small, weighted object, a tactical tracker of our own. "If you're going to be hunted, Alina, you have to learn how to lead the hounds into the trap." I took the device, its cold weight a reminder that the refined world of the Romanos was over. I wasn't just a wife or a witness anymore. Under Marco's shadow, I was becoming a hunter. I looked back at the black sedan one last time, not with fear, but with the cold calculation of a woman who knew exactly how much pressure it took to make a man like Victor break. The training didn't take place in a gym or a classroom, but in the chaotic, gray-toned heart of the city's industrial district. Marco De Luca stood by the brick wall of a deserted warehouse, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light. He was a man of few words, his silence a weapon honed by decades of service to the Valenko name. "Eyes on the glass, Alina," Marco said, his voice a gravelly low tone that commanded attention. He pointed toward a grimy shop window across the street. "Don't look at the street directly, look at the reflections. The world is a mirror if you know how to tilt it." I stared into the distorted glass, watching the rhythmic flow of pedestrians. "What am I looking for?" "Patterns, not people," he replied. "A person walking is just a stranger. A person stopping every time you stop, or a car that makes 3 left turns to stay behind you, that's a predator. Victor isn't sophisticated enough for a professional hit yet. He's panicked. Panicked men hire cheap talent." I focused, my eyes scanning the reflection of a black sedan parked at the far corner. It had been there since we left the chapel. When we moved, it moved. When we lingered, it idled. "The black sedan," I whispered, the realization chilling my blood. "It's been behind us for 6 blocks. Marco nodded almost imperceptibly. "Good, look at the driver, side mirror." I adjusted my stance, catching a glimpse of a man in a hooded sweatshirt, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't have the polished veneer of Victor's usual security. He had the jagged, desperate look of the street-level thugs Victor used to clean up messier business disputes. "He thinks he's intimidating you," Marco said, stepping closer to me, his presence a wall of granite. "Victor wants you to feel small again. He wants you to think that even with Dante, you aren't safe." "He's wrong," I said, a new kind of steel hardening in my voice. I watched the thug through the reflection. He was amateur, sloppy, a reflection of Victor's own crumbling composure. "He's not trying to kill me, he's trying to track where I'm going." "Then let's give him a destination he won't forget," Marco said, reaching into his jacket and handing me a small, weighted object, a tactical tracker of our own. "If you're going to be hunted, Alina, you have to learn how to lead the hounds into the trap." I took the device, its cold weight a reminder that the refined world of the Romanos was over. I wasn't just a wife or a witness anymore. Under Marco's shadow, I was becoming a hunter. I looked back at the black sedan one last time, not with fear, but with the cold calculation of a woman who knew exactly how much pressure it took to make a man like Victor break. The Grand Metropolitan Ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, the kind of place where reputations were built or butchered over hors d'oeuvres. A week ago, I had been the woman the city whispered about in hushed, pitying tones, the wife discarded on a stage like yesterday's news. Tonight, as the massive gold leaf doors swung open, the whispers didn't just return, they stopped entirely. I felt the heat of the spotlight before I saw the cameras. My dress was a gown of midnight velvet that clung to my skin like a second thought, but my true strength came from the man whose arm I held. Dante Valenko didn't walk into a room, he occupied it. His presence was a silent thunder, and as we moved toward the center of the auction floor, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. "Deep breaths, Alina," Dante murmured, his voice so low it was meant only for me. "You aren't a guest tonight, you're the event." Across the room, I spotted them. Victor and Isabella stood near the bar, flanked by the socialites they had fought so hard to impress. Victor's drink froze halfway to his lips, his face draining of color as he took in the sight of the woman he had tried to ruin, now standing at the side of the most feared man in the tri-state area. The auctioneer cleared his throat, but the room's attention remained fixed on us. Dante didn't head for the back rows where the secondary players sat. He led me straight to the front, to the table reserved for the evening's primary patrons, a table that Victor had been told was full. With a single look from Dante, the staff scrambled to pull out my chair. Dante didn't wait for them. He leaned down, his movements fluid and courtly, and tucked the chair in for me himself. It was a small gesture, but in this room, it was a declaration of war. By treating me with the reverence of a queen, he was telling every investor and socialite in the room that I was protected, valued, and, most importantly, powerful. "I believe the opening bid for the Morty Docks redevelopment is $5 million, the auctioneer stammered, his eyes darting toward Dante. Victor stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly. 5.5. Dante didn't even look at the stage. He kept his gaze on me, reaching out to lightly trail his thumb over my knuckles, a public display of affection that sent a shockwave through the room. 10 million, Dante said, his voice effortless. In Miss Morty's name. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at Victor, seeing the vein throbbing in his temple. He had tried to sell my father's legacy to save his own skin, but tonight, I wasn't just buying it back. With Dante's hand over mine, I was showing the world that the Romanos were no longer the ones in control. The discarded wife was gone. In her place stood the woman who was about to take everything. The victory at the auction had provided more than just a public reclaiming of my name. It had provided a distraction. While Victor scrambled to explain to his investors why he'd been outbid by his own, discarded wife, I retreated to the sanctuary of Dante's study, the black tablet resting on my knees. The glow of the screen felt colder tonight. Following the blood and ink of my father's ledger had led me to the Romano Family Foundation, the charity Isabella presided over with a saintly smile and a heart of ice. On the surface, it funded orphanages and art restorations, but as I dug into the subledgers, the numbers began to warp. Patterns, Alina, Marco's voice echoed in my head. I looked for the patterns. Every month for 3 years, the foundation received massive donations from offshore accounts linked to the Varga cartel, Dante's most violent rivals. Within 48 hours, those same amounts were dispersed as administrative grants to a network of construction companies owned by Victor. The Romanos weren't just greedy, they were a clearinghouse for cartel blood money. They were using my father's legacy, the very docks he died for, as the entry point for shipments that never appeared on a manifest. I felt a wave of nausea. My marriage hadn't just been a lie, it had been a front for a criminal enterprise that was feeding the city's darkness. "You found the pulse," Dante said, stepping into the room. He didn't turn on the lights. The blue light of the tablet carved his features into sharp, dangerous angles. "They're laundering millions, Dante," I whispered, my fingers trembling as I pulled up a series of wire transfer confirmations signed by Isabella. "The charity is a ghost. It's just a digital laundry mat. And Victor, he's using the dock redevelopment project to build the infrastructure the Vargas need to move their product inland." Dante leaned over my shoulder, his warmth a stark contrast to the cold data on the screen. He studied the transfers, his jaw tightening. "They aren't just laundering money. They're selling the city to the highest bidder. If these transfers go through the final audit next week, the Vargas will have a permanent foothold in Chicago." I looked up at him, the weight of the discovery settling into my bones. If I leak this now, the Romanos go to prison, but the Vargas, they'll come for whoever exposed them. "They'll have to go through me first," Dante said, his hand covering mine on the tablet. His touch was no longer just a gesture of protection, it was a pact. "You've found the paper trail, Alina. Now we use it to lead them to the edge of the cliff." I looked back at the screen, at the names of the people who had destroyed my family. They thought they had buried their secrets with my father. They didn't realize that I was the one holding the shovel. The sky over the cemetery was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy with the threat of a storm that refused to break. I stood before my father's headstone, the granite cold beneath my fingertips. I had come here seeking clarity, but the silence of the dead offered no shield against the living. The sound of gravel crunching behind me made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't need to turn around to know the scent of expensive cologne and desperation. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Alina," Victor's voice sneered, stripped of the polished charm he used for the cameras. I turned slowly. He looked haggard, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. The stock market crash and the rumors I'd planted were eating him alive. He wasn't alone. 2 of the thugs I'd seen in the black sedan lingered by the iron gates, their hands tucked ominously into their jackets. "Get out, Victor," I said, my voice as steady as the stone beside me. "This is holy ground. You don't belong here." "I belong wherever my interests are," he snapped, stepping into my personal space. He pulled a thick document from his inner pocket, not divorce papers this time, but a non-disclosure agreement. "You're going to sign this. Now, you'll recant the rumors about the Phoenix merger and swear that the files you stole are forgeries. Do it, and I'll give you enough money to disappear. Refuse, and Isabella will ensure you're buried right next to your father today." He shoved a pen into my hand, his grip bruising. "Sign it, before I lose my patience." I looked down at the paper, then back at him. "My father died because he wouldn't sign your lies, Victor. What makes you think I'm any different?" His face contorted with rage, and he raised his hand as if to strike me. "You arrogant little—" "I wouldn't finish that motion, Mr. Romano." The voice didn't come from behind me. It came from the shadows of the weeping willow 10 feet away. Dante Valenko stepped into the light, but he wasn't alone. Marco and 3 other men seemed to materialize from the mist, surrounding Victor's thugs before they could even reach for their waistbands. It was a surgical encirclement, silent, absolute, and terrifying. Dante walked toward us, his footsteps silent on the grass. He didn't look at the thugs, he looked only at Victor's hand, which was still clamped onto my arm. "The lady said no, Victor, and in my world we respect the word no." "This is family business, Valenko," Victor yelled, though his voice shook. "Stay out of it." "Alina is my business," Dante said, stepping between us. He didn't raise his hand. He simply leaned in, his presence so suffocatingly dominant that Victor instinctively recoiled, dropping the pen. Dante picked up the NDA, glanced at it for a second, and then slowly tore it into thin, white strips. He let them flutter onto the grass like confetti. "The next time you approach her," Dante whispered, a sound colder than the winter wind, "it won't be a priest you're meeting in a cemetery. It will be a coroner." Victor looked at his men, who were already being disarmed and forced to their knees by Marco. Realizing the tide had turned into a tsunami, he backed away, stumbling over a floral arrangement. "This isn't over," Victor hissed, though he was already retreating toward the gates. Dante didn't answer. He turned to me, his hand reaching out to touch my cheek, checking for a bruise that wasn't there. "Are you all right?" "I am now," I said, looking at the torn paper on my father's grave. The fear was gone. The hunt had officially moved into its final phase. The storm that had been threatening at the cemetery finally broke, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private hangar at O'Hare. The terminal was a ghost town of sleek jets and hushed engines, but at the far end of the tarmac, a Gulfstream was idling, its turbines whining like a cornered animal. Isabella Romano stood at the base of the boarding stairs, her signature composure finally frayed. She was wrapped in a cashmere coat that cost more than most people made in a year, clutching a designer briefcase that I knew held the encrypted drive for the Varga accounts. She wasn't just leaving, she was taking the evidence of the laundering with her. "Going somewhere, Isabella." My voice carried over the wind, sharp and cold. She spun around, her eyes widening as I stepped out of the shadows of the hangar. Beside me, Marco De Luca was a wall of silent, lethal intent, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "Alina," she hissed, the mask of the elegant matriarch slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "You should have stayed in the gutters where Victor found you. Do you really think this little crusade matters? I have friends on 3 continents who will ensure you're erased by morning." "Your friends have been busy, Isabella," I said, walking toward her. I held up the black tablet, the screen glowing with a list of the Romano family's primary creditors. "They've been selling, and they've been selling fast." She scoffed, reaching for the stairs. "My debts are handled. Victor secured the merger." "Victor secured nothing," I countered. "The Phoenix leak didn't just tank the stock. It triggered a margin call on every loan you used to fund your charity. You thought you were laundering for the Vargas, but you were actually borrowing against assets you no longer owned." I tapped the screen, and a final confirmation document appeared. "As of 20 minutes ago, the Valenko syndicate has acquired 98% of the Romano debt. The docks, the estate, the foundation, even this plane. It all belongs to Dante now." Isabella's face went a sickly shade of gray. She looked at the pilot, who stood frozen at the top of the stairs, then back at Marco. "You can't do this. I'll go to the police. I'll tell them about Valenko's involvement." "With what evidence?" Marco asked, his voice a low rumble. "The drive in your hand. We've already intercepted the digital transfers. You aren't a business partner anymore, Isabella. You're a liability." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Without the Varga money and without the Romano name, she was nothing. The woman who had ordered my father's death was finally standing on the same quicksand she had built for everyone else. "The police are already at the estate for Victor," I said, stepping within inches of her. "But for you, I think a different kind of justice is coming. The Vargas don't like it when people lose their money." I reached out and plucked the briefcase from her numb fingers. "You told me once that I was beneath your status. You were right. I'm not a Romano, I'm a Morty, and we always finish what we start." I turned my back on her, walking toward the car with Marco, leaving her alone on the rain-slicked tarmac as the blue and red lights of the authorities began to pulse in the distance. The house hadn't just fallen, it had been demolished. The sirens had faded into the distance, leaving the Romano estate in a silence so heavy it felt historical. I stood on the grand marble staircase, watching the forensic teams carry out the final crates of evidence. Victor had been led away in handcuffs an hour ago, his face a mask of pathetic disbelief, still trying to shout about his connections until the squad car door silenced him. Isabella's lawyers had sent a frantic message offering a massive settlement, enough to live in luxury for 10 lifetimes, if I would sign a gag order and release the debt claims. I didn't even open the file. Instead, I tore the digital offer from the tablet and watched it vanish into the bin. "They still don't get it," I said, my voice echoing through the foyer that once felt like a prison. "They think everything has a price." Dante stepped up beside me, his presence no longer the shadow of a predator, but the steady anchor of a partner. He looked around at the cold, opulent walls that had seen so much cruelty. "The deed is transferred, Elena. The Romano name is stripped from the gates. What do you want to do with this mausoleum?" I looked at the portrait of Isabella that still hung above the fireplace and felt nothing but a distant, cold clarity. I'm not selling it, and I'm certainly not living in it like they did. I'm turning it into the Morty Foundation, a sanctuary for families the Romanos displaced, and a center for workers' rights at the docks. I want to fill this house with the people they tried to step on. Dante's mouth curved into a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. A poetic ending, turning their seat of power into a shield for the weak. I turned to him, the morning sun finally breaking through the clouds and spilling across the marble floor. "I couldn't have done it without your shadows, Dante, but I'm finished being a ghost in your world, too. If we do this, it's as equals, the Mortys and the Valenkos, truth and power." Dante reached out, taking my hand in his. He didn't lead me this time, he simply stood with me. "I wouldn't have it any other way. The city needs to see what happens when the right people take control." As we walked out onto the terrace, I looked down at my hands. They were no longer trembling. The quiet pain that had lived in my eyes for years had been replaced by a fierce, steady light. I was no longer the wife who was erased or the victim who was discarded. I was the architect of my own future. The Romanos were a dark chapter that had finally been closed. I looked at Dante, then out at the city skyline where the Morty name would soon shine again. We were the new order. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving the story, I was writing it.